The atmosphere does not merely vanish, it detaches. One moment, the invisible hand of gravity holds every molecule of oxygen, nitrogen, and argon against the crust with the weight of a planetary embrace, and the next, that grip is severed. Everything that is not bolted to the bedrock begins a slow, agonizing ascent into the void. The sensation is not one of falling, but of the world falling away from beneath your feet. There is no stomach-churning drop, only a haunting, weightless drift as the trillion tons of air that once pressed against your skin begin to expand. The pressure drops toward zero at a rate that defies biological comprehension. Within the first 2 seconds, the air inside human lungs expands violently, seeking escape as the external environment transitions into a vacuum. Eardrums rupture with a wet, popping sound as the internal pressure of the body exceeds the rapidly thinning atmosphere. Buildings do not simply float, they are torn from their foundations by the internal pressure of the air trapped within them. Skyscrapers, designed to withstand the downward force of gravity and the lateral force of wind, find themselves useless against an upward kinetic surge. The glass panes of every office tower in the world shatter outward simultaneously, creating a shimmering cloud of crystal shards that hang in the air like frozen rain. The soil itself begins to lift. Not in large chunks, but as a fine, granular mist, as the gases trapped between grains of dirt expand and push the surface into the sky. Trees are ripped upward, their deep root systems snapping like dry twigs as the buoyancy of the entire biosphere shifts toward the stars. The oceans, vast and heavy, do not stay in their basins. The surface of the Atlantic and the Pacific begins to boil, not from heat, but from the lack of pressure, turning the top layers of the sea into a chaotic, frothing foam that rises in massive, kilometer-wide spheres of saltwater. This is the end. But to understand why, we must rewind to the beginning. To comprehend the absolute necessity of gravity, one must first look at the delicate mechanical balance that governs our daily existence. We live at the bottom of a deep gravity well, a curve in the fabric of spacetime created by the 5.97 septillion kilograms of mass beneath our feet. This curvature is the fundamental anchor of our reality. It dictates the behavior of every fluid, the tension of every muscle, and the stability of every structure. Gravity is the invisible glue that maintains the atmospheric envelope, keeping the gases we breathe from leaking into the cold, hungry vacuum of space. It is the force that provides the weight necessary for friction. Without gravity, wheels cannot turn, feet cannot grip the ground, and nothing can remain stationary. Centrifugal force is the silent partner in this equation. As the Earth rotates at approximately 1,670 km per hour at the equator, it is constantly trying to fling everything on its surface out into space, much like water spinning off a wet tire. We do not feel this outward pull because gravity is roughly 300 times stronger, pinning us firmly to the crust. We exist in a state of perpetual downward acceleration that masks the fact that we are standing on a spinning sphere hurtling through a void. The very architecture of our world, from the way water flows down a riverbed to the way the tectonic plates grind against one another, is a direct result of this constant, unrelenting downward pull. If this force were to vanish, even for a brief interval, the results would not be a peaceful float, but a violent, kinetic rebellion of every object against the surface of the planet. The clock starts now. The first 10 seconds are a symphony of mechanical failure. Because the Earth is rotating, losing gravity does not mean you simply hover, it means you continue in a straight line at the velocity of the Earth's rotation at your specific latitude. At the equator, you are suddenly a projectile traveling at nearly 500 meters per second relative to the center of the planet. In the first second, you are lifted centimeters off the ground. By the fifth second, you are several meters in the air. Cars that were cruising along highways find their tires losing contact with the asphalt. The friction that allowed them to steer and brake vanishes instantly. These multi-ton vehicles become unguided missiles, tumbling through the air as the torque of their spinning engines causes them to flip and rotate in a chaotic dance of steel. Inside homes, the transition is terrifyingly quiet at first. The coffee in a mug does not spill, it rises in a perfect, trembling sphere of brown liquid. The mug itself lifts off the table. Then, the structural integrity of the house begins to fail. Most residential buildings are held together by the weight of the roof pressing down on the walls, which in turn press down on the foundation. Without gravity, the nails and screws are the only things holding the structure together against the internal pressure of the air. The walls begin to groan and bow outward. Dust that has settled for decades in floorboards rises in a choking cloud, turning the air into an opaque fog of debris. Between 10 and 30 seconds, the atmospheric crisis reaches a terminal phase. The Earth's atmosphere is held in place solely by the planet's mass. Without that pull, the air begins to bleed into space at supersonic speeds. This is known as adiabatic expansion. As the air moves upward, it cools at a staggering rate. The temperature drops by dozens of degrees in seconds. High-altitude clouds are sucked downward and outward, while the air at sea level rushes toward the vacuum. People struggling to hold on to fixed objects find that there is no air left to breathe. The oxygen molecules are too far apart for the lungs to harvest. The blue of the sky begins to deepen into a bruised purple, then a harsh, stark black, as the scattering of sunlight, Rayleigh scattering, diminishes with the thinning air. The oceans are now a scene of cosmic horror. Water is heavy, but without gravity, the hydrostatic pressure that keeps the deep ocean compressed disappears. The water begins to expand. Massive bubbles of dissolved gases, oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon dioxide, form within the water column, causing the seas to effervesce like a freshly opened bottle of soda. This massive expansion pushes the surface of the ocean upward in colossal, bloated mounds. Ships are no longer floating, they are suspended within a rising slurry of foam and mist, their propellers spinning uselessly in the vacuum-thinning air. Marine life, from the smallest plankton to the largest blue whales, is lifted from the water, their internal organs expanding and rupturing as the pressure that has shaped their evolution for millions of years vanishes. Most turn away from the void. But here at Velastrix, we decode the math behind the chaos. Join the archive by subscribing now. As we cross the 40-second mark, the very crust of the Earth begins to react. The Earth is not a solid, rigid ball, it is a pressurized vessel. The weight of the crust normally keeps the molten mantle and the high-pressure gases beneath the surface in check. Without the downward pressure of gravity, the lithosphere experiences a massive unloading event. The ground beneath cities begins to fracture and heave upward. This is not an earthquake, which is caused by lateral movement, but a vertical expansion of the Earth itself. Large segments of the Earth's crust, particularly in geologically active zones, begin to crack. Steam and magma, no longer suppressed by the weight of the rock above, blast upward in towering geysers of fire and ash, adding to the debris cloud encircling the planet. In the cities, the devastation is total. Skyscrapers are now hundreds of meters in the air, drifting like erasure monuments in a darkening sky. They collide with one another in slow motion, the impact of billions of kilograms of steel and concrete creating shockwaves that ripple through the floating debris. There is no sound to these collisions anymore, as the air is now too thin to carry longitudinal waves. It is a silent movie of planetary destruction. Every unanchored object, every tree, every animal, every human, every drop of water, is now a part of a chaotic, expanding shell of matter moving away from the Earth at hundreds of kilometers per hour. At 50 seconds, the lack of gravity affects the planet's core. The inner core is a solid ball of iron and nickel kept solid by immense pressure. While the loss of surface gravity wouldn't immediately melt the core, the sudden shift in the planet's internal tension would trigger massive subterranean shifts. The magnetic field, generated by the movement of the liquid outer core, would begin to flicker and warp. This magnetic shield is our only protection against solar radiation. As it wavers, high-energy particles from the sun begin to slam into the upper reaches of the disappearing atmosphere, creating haunting, violet auroras that fill the entire sky, even at the equator. It is a beautiful, lethal light show marking the erasure of the biosphere. The final 10 seconds of the minute are a descent into a nightmare of physics. The Earth is now surrounded by a sphere of everything that used to be on its surface. This debris field extends kilometers into the sky. The sunlight, no longer filtered by a thick atmosphere, hits the floating objects with raw, unfiltered ultraviolet and infrared intensity. One side of every floating object begins to bake, while the side facing away from the sun freezes in the shadow. The transition is so violent that materials like plastic and wood begin to off-gas and crack. Then, at the 60-second mark, gravity returns. The transition is instantaneous. The curvature of spacetime snaps back into place. The 5.97 septillion kilograms of mass suddenly reclaimed their dominion. Everything that has spent the last minute drifting upward is now subject to an acceleration of 9.8 meters per second squared, pointed directly at the center of the Earth. But the objects are not just falling, they are falling from heights of kilometers. The atmosphere, which has expanded into a vast, thin shell, is slammed back toward the surface. This creates a global sonic boom of such magnitude that it would likely liquefy the internal organs of any biological entity that survived the initial vacuum. The air compresses so rapidly that it heats up instantly, creating a compression flash that ignites flammable materials across the globe. This is the hammer of the atmosphere falling back onto the anvil of the Earth. The oceans, which had risen in great frothing domes, now collapse. This is not a wave, it is a planetary-scale impact. Trillions of tons of saltwater slam back into the ocean basins, creating a pressure wave that travels through the crust, triggering real earthquakes of magnitudes never before recorded. The splash from this collapse sends plumes of water back into the stratosphere, while the resulting tsunamis, hundreds of meters high, sweep across what is left of the coastlines at the speed of sound. The buildings, the cars, and the billions of tons of debris that were floating kilometers high now become kinetic impactors. A skyscraper falling from 5 kilometers has the kinetic energy of a localized resonance event. Thousands of these darts of steel and concrete rain down across the globe, pulverizing the foundations they once stood upon. The soil, which had lifted as a fine mist, now returns as a suffocating blanket of mud and rock, burying everything that remains under meters of sediment. The thermal energy released by this return to normalcy is staggering. The kinetic energy of all that falling mass is converted into heat upon impact. The temperature of the remaining atmosphere spikes. In a single minute of weightlessness followed by a single second of return, the Earth has been scrubbed clean. The forests are gone, stripped and shattered. The cities are literal craters of twisted metal and powdered stone. The atmosphere is a choking mixture of ash, steam, and toxic gases released from the mantle. When the dust finally settles, the Earth is still a sphere of rock orbiting a star, but it is a silent one. The complex systems that took billions of years to evolve, the delicate balance of the nitrogen cycle, the migration patterns of birds, the intricate web of human civilization, have been deleted by a 60-second glitch in the fundamental forces of the universe. The planet remains, but the world is gone. We are reminded that our existence is not a right, but a temporary permission granted by the unwavering constants of physics. We are the tenants of gravity, and our lease is subject to the stability of the void. To explore the impossible and visualize the unknown, subscribe to Velastrix.